Good evening. This hearing is now in session and is being recorded to maintain a permanent record. My name is Danielle Boudreau. I am the rulemaking coordinator at the Department of State Lands, and I will be serving as the department's hearing officer. Today's date is October 20th, 2025, and the time is 6:30 p.m. Joining me from the department are
Hello, I'm Melody Rudenko with the Oregon Department of State Lands. I'm our mitigation policy specialist.
Good afternoon. I'm Gray Wolf. I'm our mitigation specialist at DSL.
Thank you. The purpose of this evening's meeting is twofold. We will begin with a 30-minute information session, followed by the public rule hearing for the proposed rule changes for the Department of State Lands administrative rules governing compensatory mitigation of Oregon's waters and wetlands for removal fill permits. During the information session, Melody will provide information regarding the need for rulemaking and a summary of the proposed rule changes. We ask that you hold any questions until the presentation is ended, at which time we will gladly answer those questions. Once that is concluded, we will begin the public rule hearing. Please note that during the rule hearing, the department will not be answering any questions or responding to comments. This meeting will conclude when all participants who wish to comment have finished, or at 8 p.m., whichever comes first. For our Zoom protocols for this evening, we ask that each person who wishes to speak raise their hand. In order to raise your hand, click the reactions near the bottom of your screen and click raise hand. And if you need technical support, please message us in the chat. Please keep your mic muted unless it is your turn to speak. Use of video is encouraged, and we ask that all participants be respectful of each other and DSL representatives. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Melody.
Thank you, Danielle, and thanks folks for being here. Next slide, please. So as you may know, since you're interested in the Oregon removal fill rules, that Oregon does protect its wetland streams and other waters of the state, because in Oregon we believe that it is those waters are providing essential benefits to the humans and the environment in Oregon. Some of those benefits include reducing flooding, keeping water clean, providing important habitat, and supporting our recreational activities. So Oregon Department of State Lands provides that protection to those wetland streams and other waters of the state by requiring mitigation, specifically compensatory mitigation, when authorizing impacts to wetlands and streams. And we do that through our removal fill permitting program. So requirements for mitigating impacts to wetlands have been well established in our existing rules, but comprehensive guidance for mitigating for the impacts to streams and rivers when we authorize those actions has still been needed. And this need for stream guidance is the primary reason for this rulemaking. Three additional reasons that we identified and addressed through this rulemaking were also that we needed to clarify the requirements for folks who work with us to sponsor different types of mitigation banking projects, as well as our need to address losses of wetland acreage from compensatory mitigation methods that do not fully replace the area of impacted wetland acres. And then finally, we wanted to reduce some of the barriers to voluntary habitat restoration that exist under our current permitting rules. Next slide. So the goals of our rulemaking and really of all this work is really to increase the clarity and efficiency and transparency of our programs and of how the regulatory process works in Oregon. And for our stream mitigation, the prime goal is for our accounting framework to be consistent and predictable, as well as effective for meeting the goals that Oregon has for our natural resources. And then finally, with new forms of mitigation banking projects now being proposed in Oregon, such as umbrella banks or other sponsors being interested in the in lieu fee mitigation programs. We were made aware that we needed to provide additional guidance in our rules on those processes and what our requirements would be for people wanting to become a sponsor of those types of mitigation projects. Some additional goals for this rulemaking include continuing to try to meet our state's goal of no net loss of wetlands, reducing existing limitations on what projects are considered habitat restoration when they are applying for a individual permit. That's a specific type of permit they can get from our agency, as well as offering additional options or option for the mapping of coastal waters and wetlands within tidal reaches. We did convene a rule-making advisory committee in March of 2025. There were 11 committee members, and we had 6 meetings that lasted through August of 2025. And the representatives on the RAC included uh, folks from local governments, from state agencies. We had a representative from the Cow Creek Band of the Umpqua Tribe of Indians, some typical permit applications, some environmental consultants, and nonprofit entities interested in our work. And now I would like to summarize more specifically what the rule changes are. We do have versions of the rules with the edits identified in red light strikeout form that can be reviewed. But first, I'll just go over our summary for each of these changes. And the 7 changes that I want to talk about include the stream mitigation accounting, the mitigation banking that I mentioned, are a goal for no net loss, how we can map the extent of estuaries in our tidal resources, and change to our aquatic resources, a special concern definition, how we can permit habitat restoration projects, and then rule change specific to when a tribe owns a compensatory mitigation site and how that site protection instrument will be required. So the first of our rules that I wanted to go over was how we calculate how much mitigation is going to be required when someone is proposing permanent impacts to a stream. So this isn't an approach that's currently in our rules. And that is the main reason we had to enter into this rulemaking, because currently how much mitigation will be required is determined on a case-by-case basis, meaning that there's low predictability for applicants and less consistency within our program. So we really needed to find a standardized way to replace those lost stream functions from permitted impacts. Because if you compare what we currently have for streams to wetlands, where we use like a base ratio that is depending on the approach of mitigation that the applicant took, and then we adjust that based on how well a mitigation is replacing functions, and if there was, vegetation impacts at the wetlands. So that's all very predictable for our applicants. So we wanted to do something similar with streams. So what we were able to do is come up with a standardized calculation for how to replace lost stream functions. And that calculation is described in our rule with the statement that replacement will be equal to the sum of, we use the abbreviation SFAM, which stands for the Stream Functional Assessment Method. So SFAM, valuated function scores, multiplied by the impact channel length when SFAM is applicable. So that's a description of a equation that we use to calculate those amounts. But again, it's a predictable approach that will be available, so our applicants will know ahead of time, and we can also consistently apply those requirements. Other features of our approach to implementing this stream mitigation accounting will include requiring in-kind replacement for highly valued functions, as well as a need to stay consistent with our current requirements for mitigation, for when mitigation will be required. We needed to identify times when the equation I described maybe wouldn't require the same amount of mitigation as the functions that are being lost. And so one of those scenarios we determined was when a stream would be hardened through riprap, especially a hardening of the bed of the stream. And so we do have a policy that is being enacted into rule of requiring mitigation for the hardening of those stream beds or banks, even if the functional assessment isn't able to pick up those functional changes due to the location and the type of changes that they are. And then finally, we did want to, for parity with wetlands, provide a alternative for completing this mitigation accounting approach, this what we're adopting into rule, this method. If someone can reduce their impacts down to a low enough amount, they have an alternative to not having to do that accounting. This is similar to what we do with wetlands, where we give people incentive for reducing impacts. And so those low impact stream projects can have the options of not having to use the accounting, as well as not having to do the stream functional assessment method, or provide a financial surety instrument for their mitigation site. So those are all consistent with the kinds of incentives we use for reducing wetland impacts within our rules. Within the sections of rule that are explaining how mitigation banking works, we cover a variety of mitigation project types that generate credits that could be sold on the market. So a mitigation bank is the most traditional that people are aware of, but there are also mitigation programs called the in lieu fee mitigation program that someone could sponsor, as well as umbrella mitigation banks. So that's another type of mitigation program. And once we had applicants coming to us wanting to do those kinds of projects, we decided that the rules did not have enough detail for those applicants to know, to have predictability about what they needed to provide us to go through that process. So we wanted to add that information to rule now through this rulemaking process. We also reorganized all those sections of rule so that they flow in a more logical way, kind of in the order that a person goes through when they go through a mitigation banking process. And throughout those rules, we covered each type of mitigation program, the umbrella bank, the individual bank, and the in lieu fee as it goes through, to try and add clarity on and sort of a compare and contrast of how much detail is required for each of those types. And then our next section of rule changes have to do with our law and organ that directs DSL, the Oregon Department of State Lands, to maintain a stable resource base of wetlands. And what that means is that we don't lose wetland acres through our permitting actions. And we're also directed in that law to maintain the functions and values of all waters of the state by requiring mitigation. So we have been doing that in our removal fill program, trying to enact those directives in our removal fill program since its inception. But one piece of that law that wasn't added into our rule that could help us meet those goals is a section of law that directs us to look for opportunities to increase wetland resources by encouraging wetland restoration and creation where appropriate. And so that means essentially gaining new wetlands on the landscape by creating them or restoring ones that we've lost. since that wasn't currently in rules, and it would help us to meet our directive of no net loss, which we've been struggling to meet. We have added that statement, that concept of supporting or establishing more opportunities to increase wetland resources in 2 places in rule, and those are noted on the last bullet of the slide, but essentially we've added it to what we call our principal objectives of compensatory mitigation. And the way we phrase that is to increase wetland resources through restoration and creation where appropriate. So that's very verbatim to what we have in law. And it's important to note that with principal objectives, there's a list of them, and there isn't an expectation or a statement and rule that folks are required to exactly meet every principal objective. It's more about maximizing how many, getting the best possible mitigation plan by maximizing matching those. So this objective would be added to that list of objectives that we ask folks to consider and address through their mitigation projects. And then the second place where we've added it to rule is in a section where we explain special considerations for a mitigation type called enhancement. And the reason we added it there is because enhancement is a form of mitigation that does result in a net decrease in the acreage of wetlands in Oregon, because you're making changes to existing wetlands in exchange for a loss of wetland elsewhere. And so we wanted to add this directive from Oregon law into that rule as a consideration for whether or not enhancement is appropriate in a particular scenario. And we did that by including the statement that we wouldn't be reducing Oregon's resource base of wetlands in locations with disproportionate wetland loss. And so that's a way that we can sort of prioritize restoration and creation and limit that enhancement in areas where we've had a lot of lost wetlands so we can gain those acres back. And the next few are a little more, a little easier going rule changes, just some simple things that we've added in. This particular change is simply adding another option for folks to use in order to appropriately map or accurately map the highest measured tide elevation. And this really, this additional option for doing this mapping that is called the estuary extent model, or the elevation-based estuary extent model, or E-beam. It should improve estuary and wetland mapping along our coast because it has become more difficult um, uh, with fewer high tide measurement stations to make those determinations. So this model is an option. It's not a requirement. It's one of the options folks can use when turning in a delineation or working with our agency on a permit, and they need to know where the highest measured tide is. E-beam does already exist. It's free. It's on the screen here, we have the website from the Pacific Marine Estuary Fish Habitat Partnership where it's hosted. And what it does is use light detection LiDAR, which is, again, a reflective topography mapping, and some modeling of estuaries to provide a better model of the extent of an estuary. So again, it's just one more option to get accurate mapping. And the reason it really is important for folks who live in tidal areas is that helps us determine the extent of state jurisdiction, but also helps us understand where we will get tidal fluctuation, which is very important in project design considerations. Next slide. We made a slight change to our definition of aquatic resources of special concern to better reflect our policy on determining if something is an aquatic resource of special concern. And what those are waters of the state that are rare and important. And we do currently define them in rule and make sure that when someone has to impact them, they can't avoid it, that they provide mitigation that is exactly the same sort of aquatic resource of special concern. We call that in kind because they are rare and important and need to be replaced by the same type of aquatic resource. And what we do when we're trying to determine if something is an ARSC is we consider, like, is it naturally rare? Has it been degraded over time? Is it difficult to replace? And so that irreplaceability that we were already considering when working on ARSCs is what we're trying to add into the definition here so that it better reflects what an ARSC really is on the landscape. And so what that would make the ARSC definition read, or aquatic resource of special concern definition would read, that they are waters of the state that provide functions, values, and habitats that are irreplaceable, difficult to replace, or limited in quantity because they are naturally rare or have been disproportionately lost due to prior impacts. And then the definition does have a list of examples. It says these include bogs, fens, cold water habitat, hot springs, interdunal wetlands, kelp beds, mature forested wetlands, native eelgrass beds, off-channel habitats such as alcoves, side channels, ultramafic soil wetlands, vernal pools, wet prairies, wooded tidal wetlands, and certain alkaline wetlands and lakes, and others as determined by the department. And so the only other edit we made to that definition, beyond the concept of irreplaceability or being difficult to replace, is we reordered the examples. It's still the same list of examples, we just changed the order of them so that it matched this definition in another division of DSL rules. Having those examples in a different order just could have led to confusion, so we wanted the definitions to match since we did intend to say the same thing. We're finishing up with just our last two changes, and this is one we're excited about for habitat restoration projects. We ha ha have been looking for ways to make the process more straightforward, a little faster for voluntary habitat restoration projects that folks bring to our agency. And there were some barriers that we had identified as um, making someone who's doing one of these beneficial projects had to provide a higher level of detail in their applications or more information than was necessary to evaluate a project that really was a net benefit to aquatic habitats. And so we updated that definition because it would allow for easier permitting, remove some of those barriers, but also because our definition had a requirement to return a site or a habitat to past conditions without really defining what was meant by that, and kind of ignoring the fact that habitats here have always been managed by humans. We evolved together and we've always managed those habitats. Um, and we've kind of changed those statements about prior condition and before disturbance to reflect that what we're looking for is projects that improve the ecological conditions of those habitats. So a more open-minded, broader approach to how we define a habitat restoration project. And just to note that that wouldn't change um, what permit someone has to apply for. That's set already in rule. This is more about when someone is having to get a individual permit for a habitat project. We're removing some of the barriers for that project, not changing which permit a person would need to get. Okay, thanks. Um, and then our last change that I'm going to talk about today is in our section of rule where we explain the requirements for administrative protection of a compensatory mitigation site. And so that's most typically a deed restriction that's recorded with the county where that site exists. And sometimes it's a conservation easement. Those are really common examples. But in our rule, we have a statement that public entities can administratively protect their site in other ways, like a management plan, an adopted management plan. And in the rule, we talked about public entities and private entities and ownership, with an oversight not addressing when a mitigation site is owned by a tribe. And that created ambiguity in our rule as to whether or not a tribe would be held to the requirements of a public entity like the federal government, state government, or a local government, or a private entity like a business or you and I. And so we removed that ambiguity by making a clear statement in our rule that if the mitigation site is owned by one of our federally recognized tribes in Oregon, then they would have the exact same requirements as a publicly owned site rather than a private individual. And that's the last of our changes I was going to summarize today. But if there are any questions, myself or Gray could answer those for you.
Go ahead, and then if you could just state your name and affiliation for the record, that'd be appreciated.
Thanks for making time for this. I'm Melanie Clem. I'm with American Rivers. I'm the Northwest River Restoration Director. I really appreciate the efforts to clarify rules and make it easier to expect, for people's expectations. Couple of questions I had, and I'll submit written comments. I did read the rules. It's helpful to get the briefing on kind of the intention. Couple questions I had around restoration projects and the improving ecological conditions. I'm trying to help streamline dam removal projects in Oregon. And something that comes up often is, reservoirs have certain characteristics that are not representative of, clean, cold, free-flowing stream. Removing the reservoir and returning it to more of a fluvial system rather than a custrine system sometimes is considered a conversion. And I think that, one thing that I liked about the old definition, and going back to a past condition, I could clearly point to the damming of the river was degrading conditions. So removing the barrier would be, restoring it. I'm curious how you think that might play out with the revised definitions.
Oh, I would still expect everyone to consider a barrier removal as habitat restoration, even if it was going forward to a new condition. Absolutely.
Perfect.
And I'll just note that if you see other places in our rule where we have overlooked rule that, or there like is ambiguity on how it would apply to those types of projects, please reach out to Gray and I, because that is something we want to be aware of and
Great.
support those kinds of projects. It's not the kind of project that needs more barriers. So please let
Yes,
us know.
remove
And
barriers to barrier removal. So appreciate it.
yes.
And then the other question I had was around the requirements around the federally recognized tribes. I'm curious on the discussion of if there are non-federally recognized tribes, especially with Oregon's history of termination and tribes petitioning back for federal recognition. And I recognize that might have been discussed in the advisory committee, which I didn't attend, but curious if that was in consideration as well.
It has been discussed in consideration, and it's not a easy thing for us to figure out how to address. And what I think we would do as an agency is always have kind of the intent of the project in mind and trying to make the pathway easier for anyone trying to do, good restoration, good mitigation. But I mean, the point you bring up is well taken, and I completely understand where you're coming from given Oregon's history. And yeah, as an agency, we're committed to working with everyone.
Yeah.
And the terminology that we use about the those tribes do have that federal recognition, which is kind of a different risk assessment for our agency, and we do have an obligation to work with them as a sovereign nation. So there are some like legal differences, but that would not put up a barrier for us working with a tribe that doesn't have federal recognition on any good project that they would want to do in Oregon.
Great. Yeah, I think those were for my questions. I don't have any official comments to submit tonight. I'm sorry if that's disappointing, but
No, that's
then y'all get to
perfectly
go home
all
early.
right. And with that on the record, I'm going to go ahead and skip forward past the public comment period because for purposes of the recording, we have one member of the public online and they have declined to provide an oral comment. So I need to find a place in my script to go to. Okay. So written comments may be submitted one of three ways through October 31st, 2025 at 5 p.m. You can email those, which is the most common method of submitting comments, and you can send that to dsl.rules@dsl.oregon.gov. We have an online form, which is linked on our rulemaking webpage, or you can submit it via mail to the Oregon Department of State Lands, Attention Rules Coordinator, 775 Summer Street Northeast, Suite 100, Salem, Oregon 97301. And on behalf of the department, I would like to thank you for attending this evening's meeting and for your questions. Thank you very much for those. And at this time, I hereby close the public hearing on the proposed rules for the Department of State Lands administrative rules governing the issuance of governing mitigation for removal fill purposes. Thank you.